Hi, my name is Amanda Hines,
And I'm Brenda Garcia.
and our presentation is on imagery, which is covered in chapter 13 of our text.
We defined imagery as a sensory experience created in the mind and a mental simulation which creates or recreates an experience. This can also be known as visualization, mental practice, creating or recreating experiences. And then some examples we came up with are reading a book and picturing the characters, remembering an embarrassing moment, daydreaming a scenario, and then mentally going through steps to a dance.
So a variety of theories help to explain how imagery works, which we will discuss. The first one is the psychoneuromuscular theory, which says that the neuromuscular activity patterns activated during imaging are the same as that caused in physical movement, which is pretty interesting. Like just thinking about doing a movement activates the same neurons as if doing that movement, which is pretty profound. Next is a symbolic learning theory, where images create mental blueprint for movement patterns and aids people in successful completion of the movement. So it essentially comes up with a plan for people before executing a movement or skill. Then there's the bioinformational theory, where stimulus propositions and response propositions form a particular scenario in imagery, and these two together create the most vivid image possible. So for example, like in a track race, the stimulus proportion would be the sound of the start gun, and the response would be to run.
And then to continue, there's the triple code model. This model incorporates meaning of the image to visualization. Imagery is composed of the image itself, somatic response, and the meaning of the image is important. And then in the psychological explanation, imagery aids in achieving optimal arousal levels. So this means that you don't want to be at a low or high. Low meaning not very energetic, kind of tired, and then high being too anxious. So at that optimal level, you want to be a little anxious, but also not too anxious. And then you also want to build psychological skills and motivation. So then all these models show that imagery can help athletes physically and mentally.
There are two main imagery perspectives. The first is internal, where you see yourself executing a skill from your own vantage point. And the other is an external perspective, where you view yourself from an external vantage point. So in the example of riding a bike, if I was to ask you to imagine riding a bike and you can see your hand on the handlebars and the road in front of you, then you have an internal perspective. But if you were to imagine yourself from the third person and see your full body on the bike riding down the road or street, that means you have an external perspective. One of these perspectives is not necessarily better than another, but the two most important aspects of imagery are vividness and controllability. Vividness is having the image be realistic and having it utilize all your senses, which we'll talk about later. And controllability is the ability to manipulate those images. So again, with the example of riding a bike, the vividness would be being able to just really imagine being in that environment on the road, what it feels like, what it sounds like, all those senses, which we'll talk about. And controllability is the ability to imagine yourself actually moving through that space on a bike and to manipulate that image.
Okay, so the purpose of imagery in sports, athletes can improve both physical and psychological skills through imagery. Imagery helps athletes concentrate on a given task. So one can imagine themselves staying composed and focused after some sort of distraction during a task. It enhances their motivation by seeing themselves performing well, which then motivates them to keep going. Confidence can give the player a reassurance of their abilities, and then control. It helps control their emotional responses. This also goes back to low and high arousal states in the psychological explanation theory. It also helps to acquire, practice, and correct sports skills, and then it helps to prepare for competition, specifically before competition, to imagine oneself doing a routine to enhance focus and concentration. And it also helps cope with pain and injury by speeding up the recovery of the injured area and to keep skills from deteriorating. And it also just helps with problem solving.
So imagery uses a variety of senses. There is the kinesthetic sense, which is the feeling of the body as it moves through space in different positions. Then there's a visual sense, what you see, the auditory sense, what you hear, the tactile sense, what you can feel, and the olfactory sense, what you can smell. So all of these senses are important, but the most important sense for use of imagery in sports is the kinesthetic sense because it mimics that movement aspect. Oh, sorry.
In the article, what's happening inside Simone Biles' brain when the twisties set in, they mention how gymnasts will sometimes visualize themselves underperforming due to a twisty. A twisty is a gymnastic term, or a yip, which is another term used in most sports. It's defined as by how the brain and body lose connection. Athletes tend to imagine before, during, and after practice. Though when competing, athletes report using imagery beforehand most often. This is important because it can determine their performance. So, for example, thinking of twisties before competition will give the gymnast anxiety. So the coach in the article named Warren Miller was aware of this and advised his athletes to mentally rehearse the skill and to make it a routine to do so. This helps the athlete obtain a performance, what they call a performance ready mindset. He also advises them to visualize a stressful aspect of competition during the practice so that they can become familiar with the feeling of that stressful aspect when they are truly competing.
So in this article, we chose to look at Janae Honest, who is a gymnast mentioned in it. Surprisingly enough, we didn't choose Simone Biles, but Janae's story seemed to fit really well with some of the things that we've been learning in class. So she would envision herself nailing skills over and over again, which was just a positive reinforcement. And she would imagine herself avoiding twisties. So this, her tactic shows a lot of controllability, which is manipulating your images so that they do what you want them to do. So for her instance, when she would imagine herself performing, she would control that image by imagining the positive outcome. And then controlling the performance is to take past errors and visualize a successful outcome instead of a failed outcome. So in her imagery, it was also very important to avoid imagining twisties because doing so can lead to a higher likelihood of having twisties. So she would avoid doing that and instead choose to imagine herself nailing that performance.
So there is documentable evidence that imagery can help those recovering from imagery. So our first question is, what argument would you make for physical therapists to include imagery in their rehab exercise plans? We were thinking of the various theories of imageries that support this idea. For example, it helps athletes speed the recovery of the injured area, keep skills from deteriorating. And then we were also thinking that imagery improves confidence, motivation, and preparation, which will help the patient improve psychologically, which in turn helps them with their exercises and performance levels.
For our second question, we chose to look at the different perspectives. So both internal and external perspective of imagery have their benefits, but under what circumstances would an external perspective of imagery be more effective for a recovering athlete? And what instance would an internal perspective be more effective? So we were just kind of encouraging people to think outside the box and be creative with this question. Some of our thoughts were that an external perspective could be beneficial for an athlete seeking to have motivation when returning to their sport. Perhaps a track runner can just imagine themselves crossing the finish line and successfully completing it and seeing the crowd cheering from them from that third person out of body perspective, and it might help motivate them to fully improve. And an internal perspective may be best for an athlete who is just seeking to enhance that kinesthetic sense of returning to a sport. So maybe a professional swimmer who is just imagining that feeling of being back in the water, so that once they've recovered enough, that feeling does not feel as abnormal to them. So these were just two ideas that we came up with, but we wanted to see what ideas other people had.
This is our reference.
Yeah, thank you for watching our presentation.
Thanks.
I just stretched. Oh, pause, stop. Okay.
Oh my goodness.
Stop recording.